So I want to talk about real-time learning, and where I'm headed with this is real-time learning, assuming that safety violations are going to occur. And I think one of the things that's great about racing is that it's a setting where, because of the time criticality, you give up explicitly a lot in terms of safety, but that doesn't mean that you stop thinking about safety. And this is actually something that a lot of robotics could learn from. In particular, I just want to be very clear that I am not currently an autonomous racing person. This isn't really what my lab does. So this is going to be as close as you're going to get to a racing vehicle. So this is one of these little Sphero robots driving around in a pit of sand. And what you saw in the upper left is the blue trajectory as it was attempting to track the orange trajectory. And essentially what was wrong here was that its model of the environment is dramatically wrong. In particular, its resulting controller is much too conservative in the environment that it's operating in. And so it's not pushing up against the boundaries of its stability limits enough in order to track this orange curve. And so the question is, from my perspective, how should robotics in general deal with safety constraints in settings where aggressive motion is desired? And what are other areas of robotics that involve this? So, for my group, a lot of what we care about is actually people who use robots and physically interact with them. And it's worth just sort of going through why this is a challenging problem from a control architecture perspective. So first of all, robots, when they're interacting with people physically, that means that they're essentially operating in a setting where there's no data a priori. There's lots of applications where that might be the case, so search and rescue, materials handling, but most importantly is human-machine interaction, that humans are just, incredibly, it's really hard to learn their behavior. It's really hard to infer what they want to do. It's worth noting here at the bottom that goals are very hard to specify for human-machine interaction. Intended users will work against a machine. Even if they know the purpose of the device, they will still often work against it. And they'll misuse it and abuse it in various ways, often because they want to do something that it wasn't intended for. And then back to the top here, this is all happening in context where there are soft objects involved, novel objects, the robot's breaking, the morphology might be variable, particularly as they come in and out of contact with the person. And everything is, all the data collection that needs to happen is on short time horizons, and everything is incredibly high dimensional. So you're talking sort of a minimum of 10 to 20 to 50 state dimensions, all being optimized in real time and data being collected in real time. And so one of the things that human-machine interaction often does, though, is they basically say they just slow down everything until it's essentially in static equilibrium. And of course, this is not good for the people who are using the devices, particularly if they're using it for therapy. And so my interest in this is, how do you speed up the interactions between the people and the machines so that they can be moving more aggressively, which is often helpful for therapy, but also in the case that, like we're talking about here, it also has technical advantages and precise statements of the technical challenges. And so, just to give you a sense of the types of things that robots have to learn, in general, they're always learning things like learning something about the environment, maybe keeping track of features, or even learning what those features are in real time. Dynamical models, the robots' bodies are moving, but they're also constantly changing the dynamics. We've done a lot of work where you use nominal models in an underwater environment, and then you add turbulence to the environment, and the robots have to adapt in real time to a completely new dynamic scenario by learning about the environment. And then in the case of racing against other entities, you have social navigation at high speed, where you have to extract information about other drones or other vehicles to find out what those pilots are going to do or what those autonomous systems are going to do. And the reasonable assumptions here are that, robots often know something. Like, they have something that they can bootstrap with. They may know something about their dynamics, but not know it well. They may know something about general racing behaviors, but not know it well. But a key point here is that for a great deal of these fast interactions, asymptotic learning is not very helpful. Instead, everything is happening in a single shot way where action and perception and learning are all tightly coupled to each other. And the only real advantage that robots have over other passive learning systems is that they don't need to learn passively. They can inject energy into the environment as part of their learning process. And so therefore be very purposeful about how they learn and how they take action to learn. And so my group has been working in this area of active learning and robotics for many years now. Basically, the starting point is something like you have a machine learning representation of what's unknown, but you don't parameterize it or bootstrap it. Then you have metrics on information that might be Fisher information or entropy or ergodicity. We've spent a lot of work in the past few years working with ergodicity. And then the question is, how do you use at every time step, how do you use actuation to improve learning rates? So that you can go from something where you might be taking lots and lots of offline data and learning overnight using computation to something where you're learning every 10th of a second and completely updating your entire learning architecture. We actually, so, a plug is that we have an active learning review coming out here in the next couple of weeks in IFAC Mechatronics that's in press. So from my perspective, the advantages of racing is one, of course, it's fast. And so there's very little time for decision-making. There's lots of opportunities for the environment to behave in some unexpected way. This is particularly true for ground racing, but it's also certainly true for air racing as well. Social navigation, I think, is one of the really huge opportunities in these racing environments, understanding what other drivers are going to do and extracting information from other drivers at speed is, I think, something that's going to happen. And that this is all happening in a setting where safety violations happen all the time, right? This idea that robots should be safe is this sort of misleading technical guidance that says that instead of being safety aware, that robots should always be conservatively safe, instead of asking themselves, particularly during learning processes, how should they push up against the boundaries of safety, knowing something about how they can recover. And so what this should mean is that somehow we should be leading towards constant adaptation at high speed, and then constantly asking ourselves how much computation is actually required. So the setting that we've been using is, there's a major question: how do we represent dynamics for control? And there's lots of different learning approaches, and learning approximations vary in terms of their data requirements. Like, we all know this, that deep neural networks use a lot of data and they require a lot of computation for updates. So it's very episodic. The learning tends to be very episodic. We wanted something where the entire pipeline of learning would make sense, where you're doing updates every 100th of a second or so. And Koopman operators are something that we've been using. These are operator theoretic methods, also a learning method. You can think of them as being a way of taking nonlinear systems and lifting them up to an infinite dimensional linear system. They've become much more interesting to roboticists in the past few years. I think one of the main reasons for that can be thought of that as soon as you've lifted your entire nonlinear system, including all the unknown nonlinearities, to a linear system, now as you adapt, you can use tools from linear quadratic control or model predictive control for control, but you can also use linear filtering techniques. And there's this advantage that you essentially always know that you're working in a semi-global context, because you're using these linear maps at the end of the day. And so it discourages bad design decisions at a practical level. But some other things that are useful is that Koopman operators can be updated incrementally. And I cannot emphasize enough how much this makes a difference to an operational robotic system. That if you're willing to use least squares updates to this operator, then these formulas that I'm showing you here are formulas for the entire update for every new piece of data that you acquire. And that means that you can both update your model, but you can also act to incrementally do new things in the environment that improve the quality of data that you're obtaining, and you will immediately see the payoff in that investment, because the new update will be a better update than it would have been. There are, of course, just like any sort of paradigm like this involves some artistic choices, and clearly the downfall of this and many other choices that ultimately end up looking a lot like various modalities of regression is that you have to choose basis functions. And so in everything that I'm talking about here, oftentimes we have in fact used neural networks ahead of time as a way of bootstrapping our choice of basis functions. And then the real-time learning is essentially like a real-time regression technique that is taking into account all those basis functions, but also taking into account every new piece of data that you acquire. Oh, so now the question is, how do you do active learning? And I think the sort of shortest answer here, so this paper down on the bottom right is our 2019 TRO paper. This actually won the best TRO paper that year. And the essential element is that Koopman operators have the advantage that you can efficiently compute the Fisher information over the entire unknown operator. And then you can choose a control input at every time step that either maximizes the Fisher information or balances the Fisher information against your trajectory tracking technique. And that's a very, very short story of what's a relatively technically challenging thing to do. But the key thing is that, like, once you've made this choice, once you've decided that Fisher information is an adequate information measure, which of course for anything real, that's a debatable statement. The Fisher information is easy to compute. It's hard to justify for anything that's happening out in a real environment. Nevertheless, we do it. Everyone does it, and you only stop doing it when suddenly you find out that your real system isn't very much a locally parameterized system, and that really the global entropy descriptions matter a lot. Okay, so here's a simulation that we did. And one of the things that's exciting about this is that if you just look at passive learning, where we're passively updating as we try to arrest falling after losing a rotor unexpectedly. So here, the known model is the 4-rotor model. And then unexpectedly, you lose one of those rotors. And here, the two on the left, we did active learning in simulation for 1 second, and then tried to recover. And on the right, we just collected data passively like you normally would while trying to recover. And in that setting, how quickly you recover, you have about twice as much distance from the ground. Now, this is just one trajectory. It holds over multiple trajectories, but it's all in simulation, which means you should take all of this with a grain of salt. I think also what's exciting is that if you look at this Sphero robot on the ground, so this is what the motions look like when it's learning. And basically, it just rams itself against anything it can find that's going to produce lots of sharp discontinuities. And those sharp discontinuities tell it a lot about its traction model with the ground. This is what I think you would do on a new race course. I did like dirt road racing when I was a kid out in the Western United States. And this is a very reasonable thing to do. You tend to roll your car a lot when you're doing it. And then you get, so the learning trial that I just showed you, that was all of the learning that happened. And then we're able to track that figure 8 reasonably well, reasonably aggressively, with a very, very small amount of data that we've used. But the problem is that real-time learning can, real-time learning can fail. And that's partly because you're not getting systematic data from everything. You're getting data that you've collected in some specific circumstance. And so this is a pushing example. So this is a Franca robot pushing something against a very grainy surface. And when we do the learning update, you can actually get an unstable model where even if you're not touching the block on the surface, it predicts that the block diverges away from its initial starting point. So the downside of these techniques is that you get real-time learning, but you get real-time learning that you now have to control it more aggressively, what sort of updates are allowable. And so what we started doing was looking at algorithms for imposing stability constraints on your real-time updates. And so everyone here is probably familiar with linear control and discrete time stability, but the key thing is that you want to take whatever your update would have been, if it has instabilities, you want to force them to be within the stable region of a linear model. This has been looked at for many years. Starting, there's some great papers starting back at NeurIPS in 2008. But the thing that we found is this paper by Gillis, Caro, and Sharma from 2019 on approximating the nearest stable discrete time system. And what this does is they provide an algorithm that allows you to find not just a projection of a stable operator, but actually the one that is closest to the thing that you just identified. Now, the advantage of that, so this is again not racing, but if you look at on the left, we have a steam coming out of a coffee cup. And if you just do least squares, so the training is up above, the least squares estimate is completely unstable. Like you would never be able to make decisions based on that model. But actually, so our algorithm is the SOC algorithm, then there's weighted least squares, and there's the CG algorithm, and all of them are reasonable, but the SOC algorithm is also updatable in real time. Similarly, here we have another STEAM example, and the least squares goes unstable, but then the two on the right actually overly stabilize the learning process. And so now you're not aware of some of the instabilities that the real dynamics have. This was in our paper in Neuroscience in this last year. And so once you start imposing just stability constraints, now you have something where this manipulator is able to learn the pushing dynamics of a block with 1 second of training data. And it's able to make decisions about how to push the block through the environment with that 1 second of training data. And then if we go back to the rotor vehicle example, which is, I think, the thing that might be closest to the interests of people here, you can also do things where the rotor vehicle is aware that it has a nominal stabilizing model. And so here, the blue that you just saw is actually our previous active learning. So it's actually doing a pretty decent job of arresting its fall. But the stable Koopman, by imposing that stability margin on it, now the rotor vehicle has lost a rotor and it's able to recover while not descending almost at all. So the combination of active learning along with being able to constrain what types of models you're willing to admit enables this particular example to perform extremely well under the duress of a sudden dramatic change in its dynamics. All of this holds statistically across many trials, although again, this is all done in simulation. And so you should have a correctly cynical view of anything that is only shown in simulation, although we have many experiments of non-rotor vehicle settings where this works very well. And I think because of time, I'm going to, oh, sorry, I do want to say something about this. So this last example is a great example of where this sort of active learning that David actually just mentioned as well in his talk, where if you have a stabilizing model and then you just want to collect new data about pushing up against safety margins, you're going to have to do that in a purposeful way, much like looking for those features on the ground that allow you to keep track of where you are. And so here, what this blue drone is doing is it's actually taking advantage of its stability margins and its safety guarantees to go and purposely run up against the safety margins so that it can develop more aggressive controllers in the future. This is clearly not something that you'd want to do in race time, but it is something that you'd want to do preparing for race time. Okay, so with that, I just want to say, real-time and online learning is important in all of robotics, but autonomous racing provides a specifically interesting setting for online learning. And how do you determine what the features are that are in the environment that you didn't know were there before? What features describe your dynamics that you had not been subjected to in previous data sets? And if winning is the only thing that you're worried about, how do you maximally exploit those feature structures and your ability to learn them in real time and your ability to learn things about the other pilots and things like that? Like, that's all. Autonomous racing provides opportunities for a type of learning that is basically not happening right now in robotics. I also think that we should be moving away from heavy computation. I think that's one of the things that's really great about drone racing is that, no one is tempted to fly GPUs around in the air. And in that setting, what do we do about things like certificates? Like, what does it mean to certify a drone racing system? And in particular, how do we avoid losing safe? Right, like this is sort of a theme in lots of robotics, but I think here it's one that we can really get behind, that losing safe is not the way that we want to lose. If we need to push against safety violations, we should do so in a purposeful way. Okay, so I've had amazing students working in this, lots of great funders, and with that, I'll say thanks to everyone.
All right, thank you, Todd. That was very, very thought-provoking, and thanks for making us privy to this interesting area of real-time online learning. I think you've included a lot of papers on your slides. I'm sure students in the autonomous racing community will take a look at them and extend your work into.
And let me know.